Hello everyone, tonight I've got 3 special scary stories for all of you. So before that, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Creepy Sinister, and don't forget to comment below and tell me where you're from and what time you're watching. Now get comfortable and let's begin. Story 1. It was the first night shift I spent completely alone. I thought the silence would be peaceful, until I realized it wasn't silence at all. I had just started working as an overnight security guard at a luxury high-rise in downtown Chicago. It was one of those glass and steel towers that looks beautiful during the day, but feels a little too empty once the sun goes down. My name is Caleb, and at the time I was 24 and just looking for a job that would let me study while I worked. The pay was decent, and the building was filled with high-end apartments that cost more than I'd make in 10 years. Most of the residents were successful professionals, who were usually asleep or out at events by the time my shift started. My desk was located in the main lobby, a massive room with white marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows. Usually the only sound was the low hum of the heating system fighting off the Chicago winter outside. The building had 46 floors in total, with a rooftop garden and a gym at the very top. There were 4 main elevators in the lobby, all of them modern and fast. My job was simple: watch the security monitors, do a walking patrol every 2 hours, and make sure no one who didn't live there tried to sneak in. The first few weeks were totally normal, almost boring. I would sit behind the desk with my laptop and a thermos of coffee, watching the grainy black and white feeds of the hallways. Around 11 p.m. the foot traffic would die down to almost nothing. By 1 a.m. the lobby felt like a tomb. It was easy work, and I actually liked the solitude for a while. That changed during the 3rd week of January, on a Tuesday night that felt colder than all the others. It was exactly 1:24 a.m. when I heard the distinct ding of an elevator reaching the lobby. I looked up from my desk, expecting to see a resident coming home late from a bar or a late-night flight. But when the doors to elevator 4 slid open, no one stepped out. I waited for a few seconds, thinking maybe someone was just slow or fumbling with their keys inside. After about 10 seconds, the doors slowly hissed shut again. I didn't think much of it at first. Elevators in big buildings sometimes have glitches or phantom calls where the system thinks someone pressed a button. I went back to my book, but about 5 minutes later it happened again. Elevator 4 dinged, the doors opened, and the lobby remained completely empty. This time I stood up and walked over to the elevator bank. I peered inside the car, but it was totally vacant, just the bright LED lights reflecting off the wood-paneled walls. I checked the control panel at my desk to see which floor had called the elevator down. On the screen, the system showed that elevator 4 was being summoned by the L level, which was where I was standing. That was weird because I hadn't touched any buttons. I figured maybe there was a short circuit in the wiring due to the extreme cold outside. I made a note in my logbook to tell the maintenance crew in the morning and sat back down. Around 2:15 a.m. I noticed something on the monitors that made my skin crawl. I have a row of screens that show the inside of each elevator car. I looked over at the monitor for elevator 4 and saw that it was moving. It wasn't coming down to the lobby this time, it was going up. I watched the floor indicator on the screen, 20, 30, 40. It finally stopped at 46, the very top floor. The doors opened on the 46th floor hallway, which was a dark, carpeted area with only a few dim emergency lights. No one got out, but then the elevator didn't just sit there. The indicator on the screen changed. It didn't show 47, because the building didn't have a 47th floor. Instead, the display on my monitor just went blank. The video feed inside the elevator car started to flicker with heavy static. I leaned in closer to the screen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Through the snow of the static, I could see the elevator doors closing again, but they didn't look like the modern, brushed metal doors of our building anymore. They looked like old, heavy iron gates, the kind you see in buildings from the 1920s. The light inside the car also changed from a bright white to a sickly, dim yellow. I felt a sudden chill in the lobby, even though the thermostat said it was 72 degrees. I decided I had to go check it out. It was part of my job to investigate any equipment malfunctions, and this definitely qualified. I grabbed my flashlight and my heavy ring of keys, leaving the lobby desk. I didn't want to take elevator 4 for obvious reasons, so I stepped into elevator 1. I pressed the button for 46 and felt the familiar stomach drop as the car shot upward. When I reached the 46th floor, everything looked completely normal. The hallway was quiet, the air was still, and the luxury apartment doors were all shut tight. I walked over to the elevator 4 doors and pressed the call button. The doors opened instantly. The interior was perfectly fine, no yellow light, no iron gates, just the same wood paneling I saw every day. I felt a little relieved, thinking that the monitor downstairs must just be failing. I stepped inside elevator 4 to ride it back down to the lobby. I pressed L, but the button didn't light up. I tried again, pressing it harder, but nothing happened. I tried pressing the buttons for other floors, but none of them responded. Then, without me touching anything, the elevator began to move. It wasn't going down. I felt the familiar pull of gravity indicating that the car was still ascending. My heart started to race. I looked at the digital display above the door. It showed 46, and then it did something impossible. The number changed to 47. I knew for a fact that there was nothing above the 46th floor except the roof, and the elevators didn't even go to the roof. You had to take a service ladder for that. The elevator came to a smooth stop, and the ding sounded much deeper and older than it should have. The doors opened, and I wasn't looking at a luxury hallway anymore. The area outside the elevator was an unfinished concrete space. It looked like a construction site that had been abandoned for decades. There were no lights, just the gray moonlight coming through windows that didn't have any glass in them. The air was incredibly cold, and I could see my own breath misting in front of my face. I stood there, frozen, afraid to step out, but even more afraid to stay in the car. I shined my flashlight out into the darkness. The beam hit piles of old bricks, rusted rebar, and what looked like stacks of old newspapers. I noticed a movement in the corner of my eye. I whipped the flashlight around and saw a figure standing near one of the open window frames. It was a man, or at least it had the shape of one. He was wearing a dark, heavy overcoat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face. He wasn't moving, he was just standing there looking out at the Chicago skyline. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt like it was filled with sand. I reached out and started slamming the close door button on the elevator panel. For a few terrifying seconds, the door stayed wide open. The man slowly started to turn his head toward me. I couldn't see any features on his face, just a smooth, pale surface where eyes and a mouth should have been. Just as he began to take a step toward the elevator, the doors finally hissed shut. I felt the car plummeting downward, much faster than it usually did. I had to grab the handrail to keep from falling over. The floor indicator on the panel was spinning wildly, showing numbers and symbols that didn't make any sense. I closed my eyes and prayed that the car wouldn't just crash into the basement. The elevator eventually slowed down and came to a halt. The doors opened and I was back in the lobby. The bright lights and the white marble felt like a dream compared to what I had just seen. I scrambled out of the car and ran back to my desk, my hands shaking so hard I could barely pick up my phone. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 2:31 a.m. Only a few minutes had passed, but it felt like hours. I immediately looked at the monitors. Elevator 4 was sitting in the lobby, doors closed, looking perfectly normal. I checked the recorded footage from the last 10 minutes. On the screen, I saw myself walk into elevator 1 and go up. A few minutes later, I saw elevator 4 arrive at the lobby and me jumping out of it like a madman. But when I looked at the footage of elevator 4 while I was inside it, the screen showed something different. The camera inside elevator 4 showed the car was empty the entire time. I saw the doors open on the 46th floor, and I saw the empty car sit there for a moment. Then the doors closed, and the car stayed at 46. The footage didn't show it going to a 47th floor. It didn't show me inside it at all. According to the security system, I had never stepped into that elevator. I spent the rest of the night sitting at the desk with every light in the lobby turned up to full brightness. I didn't go on any more patrols. Every time I heard a creak or a groan from the building, I jumped. I kept expecting to see that man in the overcoat walking across the marble floor, but he never appeared. When the morning shift guard arrived at 7 a.m., I didn't even say hello. I just grabbed my bag and walked out. I called my supervisor that afternoon and told him I was quitting. I didn't tell him about the 47th floor or the man with no face. I just told him the night shift wasn't for me and that I had found another job. He sounded annoyed, but he didn't push for more details. He just told me to drop off my keys and my uniform by the end of the week. A few days later, I went back to the building during the day to return my things. The lobby was busy with people in suits and delivery drivers. It looked so normal and safe in the daylight. I saw the new guard sitting at the desk, looking bored. As I was walking toward the exit, I ran into one of the maintenance guys I had talked to a few times. His name was Mike, and he had been working in the building since it opened. We chatted for a second, and then I asked him something that had been bothering me. I asked if there had ever been any accidents during the construction of the tower. Mike looked at me for a long time, his expression turning serious. He told me that back in the late 90s, when they were first pouring the foundation, there was a freak accident with a hoist. A worker had fallen from the very top. Mike said the weird part was that they never actually found the guy's body. The site was a mess of wet concrete and deep pits, and despite a huge search, he just seemed to have vanished into the structure itself. The project was delayed for months because of the investigation. Mike laughed nervously and said that some of the older guys used to joke that the building was built on top of him, and that he was still trying to find his way to the top floor. I didn't laugh, I just handed Mike my keys and left the building as fast as I could. I haven't been back to that part of downtown Chicago since then. I took a job at a small library instead, where there are no elevators and the building only has 2 floors. It's a lot quieter and the pay isn't as good, but I don't mind. Sometimes when I'm at home late at night, I think about that luxury high-rise. I think about the people living on the 46th floor, sleeping soundly in their expensive beds, completely unaware of what might be right above them. I wonder if that elevator still makes that deep ding at 2:15 a.m. and most of all, I wonder if that man is still standing by that open window, waiting for someone else to press the button for a floor that doesn't exist. I still get a weird feeling whenever I have to step into an elevator, especially if it's a modern one with a digital display. I always find myself staring at the numbers as they count up, holding my breath until the doors open on the floor I actually pushed. It's a small price to pay for staying on the floors where people are supposed to be. Some things are better left unvisited, and some floors are better left off the map. Story 2. Back in the summer of 2019, I worked the night shift at a gas station. I used to think the scariest thing I'd see was a drunk customer. I was wrong. That gas station job was definitely creepy in its own way, but it was nothing compared to the position I took later that year. I moved to a small town in northern New Jersey to be closer to my family, and I needed work fast. I ended up landing a job as a graveyard shift security guard at the Oak Ridge Mall. It was one of those classic suburban malls that had seen much better days. Most of the big anchor stores had been closed for years, leaving behind giant, empty shells of concrete. Only a few smaller shops and a struggling food court were still technically in business. During the day it was depressing, but at night it was a completely different world. My job was simple enough on paper. I had to walk the entire perimeter of the interior every 2 hours to make sure no one had hidden inside after closing. I also had to check the locks on the service corridors and make sure the remaining inventory in the shop stayed safe. The mall felt like a graveyard for the 1990s. There were these old, dried-up fountains that hadn't seen water in a decade and dusty artificial palm trees that looked like skeletons in the dark. My footsteps would echo so loudly against the tile floors that it felt like someone was walking right behind me. I tried to tell myself it was just the acoustics of the big, open space. Still, I always kept my flashlight tight in my hand and my radio turned up just to hear the static. It was better than the silence. The first few weeks were totally uneventful. I would arrive at 10 p.m., get the keys from the evening supervisor, and start my first round. I'd usually finish up around 6 a.m. when the cleaning crew arrived. Most of my nights were spent in the small security office near the food court, watching the grainy monitors. There were over 50 cameras, but half of them didn't even work. The ones that did work only showed empty hallways and the flickering lights of the few stores that left their displays on overnight. One Tuesday night, I was doing my usual 12 a.m. patrol through the North Wing. This part of the mall was almost entirely abandoned, except for one high-end clothing boutique called Lumina. It was a strange store because it looked way too nice for such a dying mall. They always kept their front gate locked tight, but the display windows were still lit up with bright, white LED lights. Inside the window, they had 3 mannequins dressed in expensive-looking evening gowns. They were those realistic ones, with molded hair and very detailed facial features. As I walked past Lumina, I did a quick sweep with my flashlight. Everything looked normal at first. The 3 mannequins were standing in their usual triangular formation. One was facing the left, one was facing the right, and the one in the middle was looking straight ahead. I remember thinking how lifelike their eyes looked when the light hit them. I finished my round, went back to the office, and ate my lunch. It was a boring night, just like every other night before it. Around 2 a.m., I headed back out for my second patrol. When I reached the North Wing again, I felt a slight chill in the air. The mall's heating system was old and would often kick off in certain sections to save money. As I approached Lumina, I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. The mannequin in the middle of the window wasn't looking straight ahead anymore. It was now turned slightly toward the left, almost as if it was looking at the mannequin next to it. I stood there for a second, staring at it through the glass. I tried to remember if I had just misremembered how it looked 2 hours ago. Maybe the store manager had come in to change the display while I was in the office, but that didn't make sense because I would have seen them on the cameras near the entrance. I checked the heavy metal gate of the store, and it was still locked with the same heavy padlock. There was no way anyone could have gotten inside without me knowing. I told myself I was just tired and that my mind was playing tricks on me. It was easy to get jumpy when you spent 8 hours alone in a dark building. I finished the rest of my walk and headed back to the security room. I decided to check the footage for the North Wing hallway just to be safe. I rewound the tape to 12:15 a.m. and watched the front of the Lumina store. I sat there for 20 minutes, staring at the screen, but nothing moved. Footage showed me walking past at 12:22 a.m., and then the hallway remained empty. There were no people, no shadows, and definitely no store managers. I felt a knot start to form in my stomach. If no one went into the store, how did the mannequin change its position? I watched the screen until 3:30 a.m., but the hallway stayed completely still. I started to think that maybe the mannequin had just settled or shifted on its stand because of the vibrations from the HVAC system. At 4 a.m. it was time for my third patrol. I really didn't want to go back to the north wing, but it was my job. I walked slowly, my heart thumping against my ribs. When I got close to the Lumina boutique, I shined my light on the window from a distance. My breath caught in my throat. The mannequin in the middle was no longer in the center of the display. It was now standing right up against the glass window, looking directly out into the hallway. The other two mannequins were also different. They were now both turned toward the glass as if they were all watching the hallway together. I felt a cold wave of genuine terror wash over me. I wasn't imagining this. The mannequins were moving closer to the gate. I walked up to the glass, my hands shaking. Their plastic faces looked so much more human up close. The one in the middle had a slight smirk that I didn't remember seeing before. I checked the gate again, pulling on the lock as hard as I could. It didn't budge. I looked through the gaps in the gate into the back of the store. It was pitch black back there, and I couldn't see any movement. I decided right then that I wasn't staying out in that hallway any longer. I practically ran back to the security office and locked the door behind me. I sat down at the monitors and pulled up the Lumina camera again. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours. At 4:37 a.m., the camera feed for the north wing suddenly started to flicker with heavy static. This happened sometimes with the old equipment, but the timing was perfect. I watched the screen intensely, waiting for the picture to clear up. When the static finally died down about 30 seconds later, the mannequins in the window were gone. The display was completely empty. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I looked at the other cameras, desperately searching for where they could have gone. Then I saw it. On a camera that pointed toward the central food court, a dark figure was standing near the empty fountain. It was too far away to see clearly, but it had the stiff, upright posture of a mannequin. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there in the middle of the open space, bathed in the dim blue light of the emergency exits. I grabbed my radio and tried to call the police, but the reception inside the mall was notoriously terrible. All I got was a loud, screeching static that made me jump. I knew I couldn't stay in the office if they were out there. The security room had a large glass window that looked out into the hallway. I felt like a bird in a cage. I turned off the lights in the office so I wouldn't be as visible from the outside. At 5:02 a.m., I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a dull, rhythmic thud coming from the hallway. Thud, thud, thud. It sounded like heavy plastic hitting the tile floor. It was slow and steady, getting closer to the security office with every second. I crouched down behind the desk, clutching my flashlight like a weapon. I prayed that whatever was out there would just pass by. The thudding stopped right outside my door. I stayed as still as possible, trying to even out my breathing. Then I heard the sound of something scraping against the wood of the door. It was a dry, plastic sound, like a fingernail dragging across a hard surface. I looked up at the handle and my heart nearly stopped. The doorknob was slowly turning. I knew I had locked it, but I still felt a surge of pure panic. The knob turned all the way to the right, then back to the left. The person or thing on the other side gave the door a firm push, but the lock held. There was a long silence that felt like it lasted for hours. I didn't dare move. I didn't even dare to look through the glass window above the desk. Finally, I heard the thudding start again, but this time it was moving away, heading back toward the north wing. I stayed behind that desk until the sun started to come up. At 6 a.m. sharp, I heard the heavy sound of the main mall entrance being unlocked by the cleaning crew. I didn't even wait for them to come to the office. I grabbed my bag, ran out the back exit, and didn't stop until I was in my car. I drove straight home, my hands shaking so hard I could barely steer. I didn't even call my supervisor to tell him I was leaving. I went back to the mall later that afternoon to drop off my keys and pick up my final check. I made sure to go while the mall was full of people. I walked past the Lumina boutique one last time. The three mannequins were back in their original triangular formation. The one in the middle was looking straight ahead, just like it had been on my first night. Everything looked perfectly normal, but I noticed one small detail that confirmed everything. On the floor of the hallway, right in front of the store's gate, there was a small scuff mark on the tile. It was a white, plastic-colored scrape that hadn't been there before. I also noticed that the mannequin in the middle was wearing a slightly different outfit. It was now wearing a dark trench coat that looked exactly like the one I had been wearing during my shift. I turned around and walked out of that mall as fast as I could. I never went back to the Oak Ridge Mall, and I heard it finally closed down for good a few months later. I sometimes wonder if those mannequins are still in there, standing in the dark, waiting for someone to walk past. I took a job at a bright, busy office building in the city after that. I don't work graveyard shifts anymore, and I try to avoid clothing stores as much as possible. There's something about the way those plastic figures just stand there watching you that I can't get out of my head. I still have dreams about that night. In the dreams, I'm back in the security office and the doorknob is turning. But in the dream, the lock doesn't hold. The door slowly opens and I see a tall, plastic figure standing there wearing my own face. It's been years since that night, but I still can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Whenever I pass a storefront window now, I always make sure to look at the mannequin's eyes. I just want to make sure they aren't looking back.
Story 3.
This happened during my night shift at a private warehouse in Memphis. Everyone was afraid of what was outside, but my fear came from inside my own house. Now I know that sounds strange since I was at work, but for a guy like me, that security office was my home. I spent more time in that windowless concrete box than I did in my own apartment. It was a high-value storage facility on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by miles of empty lots and rusted-out industrial buildings. My name is Darnell, and at the time I had been working security for about 3 years. I actually liked the night shift because it was quiet and I didn't have to deal with people. The warehouse was massive, filled with rows of electronics and high-end retail goods that were waiting to be shipped out. Because of the value of the inventory, the security protocols were pretty intense. I spent most of my 12-hour shifts locked inside the CCTV control room, which we all just called the hub. The hub was designed to be a fortress. It had no windows, a reinforced steel door, and a heavy manual deadbolt that I engaged the second I walked in. Inside, there were about 16 monitors stacked on the walls, showing every angle of the facility. It was the only place in the entire building where I felt truly safe. Outside those walls, the warehouse was a dark, echoing maze of metal shelves, but inside the hub, I was the one in control of everything. It was a Tuesday night around 11:45 p.m. when things started to feel a little bit off. It was raining hard in Memphis that night, and the sound of the water hitting the corrugated metal roof of the warehouse created a constant, low roar. Usually that sound was relaxing, like white noise that helped the time pass. But that night the rain felt oppressive. It made the warehouse feel even more isolated than it already was. I was sitting in my ergonomic chair, sipping on a lukewarm coffee and scanning the monitors. Everything looked normal. Camera 4 showed the main loading dock, Camera 7 showed the back alley, and Camera 12 showed the long, narrow corridor of aisle 14. I had a routine where I would check each screen every 10 minutes. It was boring, but it kept me focused. When you're alone in a place that big, your mind can play tricks on you if you don't stay busy. Around 1:15 a.m., I noticed a flicker on Camera 9. This camera was positioned at the very back of the warehouse, near the emergency exit that stayed locked from the outside. I leaned forward, squinting at the screen. It looked like a shadow had moved behind a stack of crates. I checked the motion sensors on my secondary screen, but nothing had been triggered. I figured it was just a moth or maybe a bit of dust floating past the lens. I tried to go back to my coffee, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I know how cliché that sounds, but in a room with 16 digital eyes, the feeling is usually the other way around. I was the one watching. Yet for some reason, the hair on the back of my neck was standing up. I did a quick manual override of Camera 9, panning it left and right, but the aisle was empty. The crates of high-end speakers sat exactly where they were supposed to be. I told myself I was just tired. Working the graveyard shift in Memphis during the winter can get to you after a while. The sun goes down early and you feel like you live in a world of permanent shadows. I decided to get up and stretch my legs, packing the small area of the control room. I checked the heavy deadbolt on the door just to be sure. It was firmly in place. Nobody could get into this room without me physically turning that latch. I sat back down and checked the time. It was now 2:08 a.m. I started doing my rounds on the monitors again, moving from top left to bottom right. When I got to Camera 5, which covered the hallway leading directly to my office door, I froze. The hallway was empty, but the light at the far end was flickering. That light was a heavy-duty industrial LED that shouldn't have been failing. It created a rhythmic pulsing of light and shadow that made the hallway look like it was breathing. I watched that screen for a long time, waiting for something to emerge from the darkness. Nothing did, but then I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It wasn't coming from the monitors. It was a soft, metallic scrape, and it sounded like it was coming from right outside my door. It was the sound of something sharp being dragged slowly across the steel surface. I stayed perfectly still, holding my breath, listening as hard as I could. The scraping lasted for about 10 seconds and then stopped. I immediately looked at Camera 5, expecting to see someone standing right there, but the hallway was completely empty. The flickering light continued to pulse, but there was no one in sight. My heart was pounding against my ribs now. I reached for the radio to call the site manager, but then I remembered he was off duty and wouldn't pick up until 6 a.m. I was truly on my own. I decided to check the recording logs. I rewound the footage for Camera 5 by 2 minutes. I watched myself on the screen through the office door, and then I watched the hallway. At 2:10 a.m., the time I heard the noise, the footage showed nothing. No person, no animal, not even a shadow. But I knew what I had heard. It wasn't a pipe or the wind. It was a deliberate, manual sound. I spent the next hour in a state of high alert. Every time the wind gusted or the rain shifted, I jumped. By 3:33 a.m., I was starting to feel a bit foolish. I convinced myself that maybe a piece of loose debris had blown against the outer wall and the sound had just echoed through the vents. It's amazing what the human brain will do to avoid admitting it's in danger. I took a deep breath and tried to settle back into my chair. I decided to focus on the monitors again to kill the remaining hours of my shift. I started looking at the reflections in the screens. Since the room was dark except for the glow of the monitors, the glass acted like a series of black mirrors. I could see my own tired face reflected in the center screen. I looked pale, with dark circles under my eyes. I looked behind my reflection, seeing the back wall of the office and the spare chair I kept for visitors. That's when I saw it, in the reflection of camera 14, which was a large monitor right in the middle of the wall. I saw a pair of shoes. They were standing right behind my chair. They were old, scuffed leather work boots, the kind people wore decades ago. My stomach did a slow, sickening roll. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just stared at the reflection of those boots on the glass of the monitor. Slowly, I tilted my gaze upward in the reflection. I could see a pair of dark trousers and then a heavy, grease-stained jacket. The person was standing perfectly still, almost like a statue. I could see the shape of a man, but his face was obscured by the glare of the screen. He was so close that I should have been able to feel the heat from his body. I should have been able to hear him breathing, but there was nothing but the hum of the computers. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, paralyzed by a level of fear I didn't know existed. My brain was screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. I was in a locked room with no windows. Finally, I gathered every bit of courage I had. I gripped the armrests of my chair and spun around as fast as I could, nearly falling over in the process. I was ready to fight, ready to scream, ready for anything. The room was empty. There was no one there. The spare chair was tucked under the small table just like it always was. The back wall was bare. I stood up, my legs shaking so hard I had to lean against the desk for support. I checked under the desk, behind the server rack, and in the small storage closet. I was completely alone. I looked back at the door. The deadbolt was still turned to the locked position. I turned back to the monitors, my heart still racing. I looked at the reflection in camera 14 again. The boots were gone. The man was gone. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself it was a hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation and stress. I sat back down, trying to steady my hands. I reached for my coffee, but it was cold. I decided I wouldn't look at the reflections anymore. I would just look at the camera feeds. I stayed glued to the live footage, refusing to blink, but then I noticed something on camera 8. This camera looked down into the main office area, which was just outside the hub. On the desk in that office, there was a small stack of papers. As I watched, the top sheet of paper slowly lifted up and drifted to the floor as if someone had just brushed past the desk, but there was no one on the screen. I felt a cold chill wash over me. I realized then that whatever was happening wasn't following the rules of reality. I looked at the monitor for camera 5 again, the one showing the hallway outside my door. The flickering light had finally died, leaving the hallway in total darkness. I could only see what the infrared sensors picked up. In the greenish, grainy footage, I saw a shape emerge from the darkness at the end of the hall. It was the man from the reflection. He was walking toward my door, but his movement was wrong. He wasn't stepping, he was sliding forward in a series of jerky, unnatural motions. Every few feet, he would freeze for a second before snapping to a closer position. It looked like a corrupted video file, but this was a live feed. He was wearing the same grease-stained jacket and the same scuffed boots I had seen in the monitor's reflection. He stopped right in front of my door. I watched him on the screen, just inches away from where I was standing. He didn't reach for the handle, he didn't knock, he just stood there, staring at the camera lens with eyes that looked like two empty pits of shadow. I backed away from the door, moving toward the far corner of the hub. I watched the monitor, waiting for him to try and break in. Instead of hitting the door, he leaned forward until his face filled the entire screen of camera 5. He opened his mouth, but no sound came through the speakers. He just stayed like that, staring directly into the camera, as if he knew exactly where I was standing on the other side of the wall. Then, without warning, the monitor for camera 5 went black. One by one, the other monitors started to shut off as well. The room plunged into darkness. The only light came from the small battery backup units on the floor, which cast a dim, eerie red glow throughout the hub. I stood in the corner, clutching a heavy flashlight like a club. I listened to the silence. It was the heaviest silence I have ever experienced. It felt like the air had become thick, making it hard to draw a full breath. Then the scraping sound started again. But this time it wasn't coming from outside the door, it was coming from the wall behind me. It was the sound of fingernails dragging across the concrete blocks. I spun around, shining my flashlight at the wall, but there was nothing there. The sound moved, sliding across the ceiling and then down the opposite wall. It was circling me, moving through the very structure of the room. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys and lunged for the door. I fumbled with the deadbolt, my fingers feeling like lead. I finally got it open and flung the door wide, sprinting out into the dark hallway. I didn't care about the man or the shadows. I just needed to get out of that building. I ran through the warehouse, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the metal shelves and crates. I reached the main entrance and burst through the doors into the pouring rain. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I locked the doors and sat there, gasping for air, watching the warehouse through the blurred windshield. Nothing came out of the building. The warehouse sat there, silent and dark, looking exactly like it always did. I drove away and didn't stop until I was under the bright lights of a 24-hour gas station 5 miles away. I quit the job the next morning. I didn't even go back to get my final paycheck in person. I asked them to mail it to me. The site manager was annoyed, but he didn't ask many questions. He just mentioned that they had been having some issues with the older parts of the facility. I didn't ask what he meant by that. I didn't want to know. I just wanted to forget the way that man looked in the reflection. A few months later, I ran into another guy who had worked security at that same warehouse. We were grabbing a drink, and I cautiously brought up the night shifts there. He got quiet and took a long sip of his beer. He told me that back in the late 70s, when the warehouse was first built, there was a maintenance man who had gone missing. They never found him, but they found his boots and his jacket in the crawl space beneath the control room. I haven't worked a night shift since then. I took a job at a local hardware store where I only work during the day. It pays less, but I don't mind. Every now and then, when I'm at home and the sun starts to go down, I find myself checking the reflections in my television or my computer monitor. I know there's nobody behind me, but I can't help but look for those scuffed leather boots. The scariest part isn't what I saw that night. It's the realization that some doors don't actually keep things out. I thought I was safe in that room because the door was locked from the inside, but I was wrong. The lock didn't matter because he was already in there with me. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, feeling like someone is standing right behind my headboard just waiting for me to turn around.